Thanks for joining me on the show today. You're in for a treat. I have an incredible guest, Michel Chikwanine, today. And his story is so incredible that you could literally take one portion of it. Just there's so many little pieces, but you take one of those little pieces, you can create a keynote speech about it alone. He was abducted as a child, recruited and forced into being a child soldier, escaped, and part of his story is that he actually had to run 3 days and 3 nights into a forest on his own as a 5-year-old child and survive through that in order to escape from the abduction. There's so much more to share. He shares about his journey to Canada as a refugee and talks about how he was bullied when he first came here and the effects of sharing your story with people to basically create a connection and the idea that someone won't hate you if they know your story. There's so many great things in this. I hope you'll enjoy. And as always, I'd like to remind you that if you know someone who's thinking about investing in real estate, I would love to help them. I would love to help create a better journey and a better life for them through real estate investments, through rental properties. That's what this is all about. It's all about creating a better life for ourselves. So reach out to me, George, at welloff.ca, or you can go to welloff.ca. Thank you. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Well Off Podcast, where the goal is to motivate, inspire, and share success principles. I'm here with somebody who has a really incredible story today. He's shared it all over. His name is Michel Chikwanine, a former child soldier born in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't want to spill or share too much of his story because I want him to kind of share it, but just to kind of do a brief overview, there was the Great War of Africa, and he endured quite a bit during that time. He was abducted as a child, and I'll kind of let him carry on from there. So before we get into your story, what I normally do on the show is kind of talk about a person's childhood, but your story, a big part of it is about your childhood. Right. So if you want to tell us kind of what that was like, the format's going to be a little bit different today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really appreciative of it. The continent of Africa in general, I think from what we tend to see or hear on this side of the world, tends to be dominated by sort of the gloom and doom news of what we see during the day, right? You see the headlines of wars and conflict, and if you've seen sort of the commercials on late night TVs, the commercials with the kids with the flies and the woman or man being like, "Oh, with $1 a day, you can save this child." Yeah. This is sort of the image that we've come to understand of the continent, but the reality is quite different, and I think my childhood in itself embodies sort of this very paradox of what the continent of Africa is, but I think in general most of the world really is, because even on this side of the world there is extreme poverty here in Canada, even though people wouldn't know, but yet it exists, and yet there's this amazing country that we also have. So my childhood was sort of very dominated by that, and so I grew up in a very beautiful home. My dad, whenever I give keynotes, I talk about my dad's height. My dad was about 7 foot, 350 pounds, huge man. I'm 5'8", so whenever I've gone to some kindergarten schools, and little kids always ask me like, how come you're not as tall as your dad? Yeah. And I can't usually explain it to them.
Wow, that is a huge difference. 7 feet tall.
He's around 7. Yeah. 6'11", but close to 7 feet. Yeah. So my mom, on the other hand, was 5'5", around there. So I think that's how that's probably where I got my height from. Right. Anyway, so my childhood was this amazing home with a dad this giant man, figuratively but also metaphorically. Not only was he this amazing man, but he was an amazing storyteller. He was an engineer. He was an electrician. He knew kung fu. He played soccer. My dad did so many things. I have no idea where he got the time, the passion to learn all these things, but somehow he did. But his main sort of goal and job was as a human rights activist and a lawyer. And so that was what dominated his day-to-day life since I was born and at least could recollect memories. My mom, on the other hand, being this little short woman, was an amazing entrepreneur. In Congo and most parts of Africa, we have this beautiful clothing. In Congo, it's called bikwembes. If you go in West Africa, they're called wax. and there are these amazing, beautiful, like colorful clothing. Right now, Beyonce wears some of them. Some of like the stars on this side of the world have sort of embraced this African clothing, this African patterns. And my mom used to make those patterns, so she used to teach other women how to make these clothing. And so, as I'm like explaining, it's like my family was these people who were just go-getters, and this was everywhere. It wasn't just my mom. There were other people that my mom would teach, and they would go on and open their own businesses. We had a dog called Berger. It was a German Shepherd that my dad brought home, and so this home was full of love and joy. But like many parts on the continent, you have this country is the third largest country on the continent of Africa, and not only was it the third largest country in Africa, on the continent of Africa, but it was this incredibly wealthy in terms of minerals, resources specifically, but also strategically on the continent of Africa. It is in the heart of Africa. It's right center of the continent. And on the eastern side and south of the country, you can find any mineral you can ever name on paper. Like it can be found in that country. And my dad, when I was a kid, always told me that Congo's resources, even though they've been its blessing, they're also its curse. And from its inception, ever since it got its independence in 1960, from a very brutal and very violent colonial process, where Belgium colonized and maimed and raped and literally killed people on the in that country. The country was just never the same. People always wanted to have their hands to get the resources. When Belgium colonized Congo, it was because they wanted to get rubber. And that was the time when tires was becoming a thing across Europe. And so Congo was actually one of the first countries to help the world have tires. And now it's become this resource called coltan, which is a mixture of cobalt and tantalum, which is used in our electronics. And it's used to coat the wiring within our electronics, and it's an important component of an electronic. But it's only found in two countries, Congo and Australia, and the largest resources of it are in the Congo. 80% of the world's coltan. And so, I guess the setting I'm trying to set is that you had this backdrop of this amazing and beautiful life. Of people literally living their lives every day, very similar to Canada. There wasn't anything different in Canada that wasn't in Congo, except with the only exception that, of course, there are areas that are extreme poverty that you could see, and there are areas that were, of course, wealthy, and the wealth gap was much more visible than it is, for example, here in Canada. And my dad's work involved trying to sort of fight to ensure that there is a bit of equity within the society that we lived in, because it was dominated by people who were corrupted and, of course, wanted to sort of step on other people to get to the top. And so from a young age, my family was engaged in this, but as a kid, I was also this little troublemaker. And so you had this dad who was this authoritarian type of guy in the house, loving authoritarian, if there can be such a thing. But also this amazing home that had beautiful rules that you had to grow up in. My dad set rules and you had to follow them. One of the things that I find funny here in Canada is whenever kids are watching TV with the family, the dad and the mom always watch whatever the kids want. Oh, well, let the kids watch. We'll watch what in my house is what the dad is watching is what everybody's going to watch. There's no choice.
Was your father the disciplinarian? Was he the one to like beat you if you did something wrong?
That was
I don't know.
That was my mom. They shared the role, but my mom was definitely the more. She still is the
I'm just assuming that somebody beat you just because it happened to me. It happens to a lot of people. I don't know.
So many times. There was a special day. If you knew what was going to happen when you open the door, and they used to have this pipe that. Now that I talk about it, I'm like, oh my God, this is very violent. But there was like this pipe that they used to beat us with whenever we did something wrong. Or there was some other punishments my dad would sort of like discipline me with. If I got late, which was always my thing, I usually came home late.
Right.
My dad would tell me to go in a corner and he'd give me like bricks. Like 2 bricks in both hands, and I'd have to hold them high, so as if I'm like lifting, like shoulder, like if you do like shoulder press, so very similar.
I've heard of that type
and
of punishment.
Literally, you're kneeling down with bricks, and he's like, if you take them down, you are not going to eat for the next few weeks.
Wow!
And so as a kid, you're like, I need to keep this down, and then you're just remembering, why did I stay out late?
Yeah.
Most of the time is because I was playing soccer with my friends, and that was my passion. So as a kid, I used to love playing soccer. I had this dream that I'd be a soccer player. And my favorite team was Manchester United, still is to this day. And I had this dream for playing for that team.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the early 1990s, I was 5 years old, so early 1990s, 1993. I was a little kid, but in Congo there was starting to become a little bit of a. We had a dictator in power. His name was Mobutu Sese Seko, and from the 1960s, when we got our independence, all the way till the 1990s, he was the president. Like, he ruled with an iron fist. This was his country. He talked about it as if it was his property.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, if he had Twitter today, he'd be tweeting about how he's the best and no one knows anything about Congo, and he would make Congo great again. Very similar type of mentalities.
Right.
Similar type of people. And so he started to get into a lot of conflicts with different countries that surrounded Congo, Rwanda to the south, to the east, and Angola to the south, and the military was starting to get stretched very thin. The military wasn't getting paid, so the military eventually went to the president asking them, one, to get paid and for a raise.
Mm-hmm.
He turned to them and said, we live in the richest country in the world, go find your own wealth. So the military turned around and they put a curfew in the whole country. If you were found on the street after 7 p.m., they would rob you. And while they were robbing you, they would tell you we're robbing you in good spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we would have dinner as a kid, you'd look outside the window at 8 p.m. and literally see people walking home naked because the military had just taken everything, their clothes, everything.
Mm-hmm.
So this was the setting that we started noticing in the 90s. And this had never happened in Congo before. Like the 80s, at least when I was born, and could recollect, the Congo was never, like, we used to see military, but it was very just military acted as police.
Mm-hmm.
But then the early 1990s, things start to change as we're like now on the news, you're starting to notice sort of like an air of tension that's in the country. And then, of course, my dad turns around and puts a curfew in my house that we need to be home before 6 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
But as a kid, of course, I didn't understand. I couldn't really put into my mind what was happening. For me, it was just like, oh, maybe just another rule to push to see how far I can push my dad. And so I went that day to school. I went to play. I went to school like every kid, and I went and I met my friend Kevin, who was 12 when I was 5. And the reason why Kevin was older than me was primarily because at school as a kid, I used to get into a lot of fights.
Mm-hmm.
And Kevin was like my way of like protecting myself. So if somebody would want to beat me, Kevin would protect me. And so I was good friends with Kevin. I always made sure I was friends with the bigger kids because the bigger kids would protect me.
Yeah.
And so we went to school, and I was sitting in math class, and the teacher was teaching, and I remember the bell rang, and the kids came into class, and everybody's running away, going home. And I sat on my desk, and I was weighing my options, thinking, do I go home and be daddy's little good boy, be home before 6 p.m., or go to the soccer field, play soccer, and have fun inside for a few minutes, and then run home afterwards? I decided to go and play a few minutes of soccer because all my friends were doing so. So I went and I started playing. And in the middle of the game, a group of army trucks came racing towards the field, grabbed all the kids, and they put us into a truck and they drove away. And we were under guns, so they were pointing guns at us. We ended up in a field, of course, and after hours and hours of driving on bumpy roads, and we were taken out of the trucks, put on the ground, and they started to give us numbers. And we were counted, given number 1, some were given number 2. And so we divided into 2 groups, and the ones that were given the number 2s were put in front of the number 1s with their back facing the number 1s. And I was number 1. My friend Kevin, who was behind me, was given the number 2. And the commander at this time starts to walk through the line, and he kept saying, "We are going to initiate you into our army." And so they grabbed a gun, and they grabbed a knife, and they slashed my wrist. As I started to bleed, they grabbed a substance called brown, which is a mixture of cocaine and gunpowder, and they rubbed it into the wound so I'd go crazy. And they put a bandage on my arm, and there's a lot of things that happened that day that I still cannot. I don't even know why that happened. But after I was drugged, they blindfolded me and they threw an AK-47 in my hand. But the gun was too heavy for me as a little kid, so they grabbed the gun as they're laughing, and they grabbed my finger, put it on the trigger, and kept yelling at me to shoot. And they kept letting louder and louder for me to shoot, so I pulled the trigger. My hand shook. I could hear the sound of the gun that went off in my ear. It was this really stinging and ringing that was just very constant. And they took off the blindfold. And this time I'm looking at my hand. It's shaking. There's blood on my left arm with a bandage on top of it. My ears are hurting. And in front of me, I see Kevin. And Kevin is not moving. Kevin seems to have like blood coming out of him. So I ran to my best friend and I grabbed him, asking him what had happened. And he wasn't answering. Instead, there were tears falling out of his eye. So I grabbed my best friend, and all I remember is just my best friend crying.
Mm-hmm.
And I grabbed him and I asked him again, like, wake up. And I thought he was doing what we were told when we were kids, which is you hear a gunshot, you drop to the ground. So I grabbed my best friend. I'm like the guns have stopped. Wake up. And the rebel commander comes behind me and he grabs my shoulder and he says, "You've killed your best friend now. Your family will never take you back. We are your only family." And they kept repeating that throughout the time that I was in that experience. So I was trained basically to be in the military.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea behind forcing me to kill forcing me to kill someone was to try and desensitize you. And that's how child soldiers are built in the very first place. They're trying to break them down and rebuild them again in their own image. And so that happened during the whole process.
I have a quick question here.
Yeah.
You said that the military was told to go find their own wealth. It's the richest country in the world.
Yeah.
Go out, find your own. So they were robbing people after curfew and whatnot. But why were they recruiting children?
Yeah, and so the part of my story that I think I come to understand a little bit later now than I understood then was, so after being trained and recruited in this way, I ended up being told that we were going to a village nearby that had food and gun supplies. And so we ended up going to this village, and it was during the raid of that village where I saw an opportunity to run, and I ended up escaping. I ran for 3 days and 3 nights in the jungle. Honestly, I have no idea how I ended up. I'm even here, 5 years old.
No food, no water?
I only ate bananas and fruits that I noticed. And I always tell people the reason why I even survived was, unlike now, when I was a kid, especially living in Beni where I was born, we were surrounded by forests. So when we were kids, we spent a lot of time outside. Mm-hmm. And one of the things my dad used to tell me whenever we were in the forest, he would always say, if you ever get lost, always go up in the tree and look across the horizon and see if you can find banana trees or a river. Because banana trees in Congo was just a sign that they were farmers.
Right.
And if it's a water body, there's always people near water, he always said. That's true. And so from a young age, I always remembered that, and he always drilled that into me. So when I got lost and I ran into the forest, from raiding this village, I ended up running and ended up in the middle of running for the 3 days that I was away. I ended up stumbling upon a town called Butembo, and Butembo was actually not far away from where my family lived. It was about 800 kilometers.
800?
From Beni, where my family lived. So I have no idea how far I walked, but all I remember was always going up in the trees where I usually slept and just looked across the horizon, tried to find banana trees.
So you had no idea.
No idea.
You just went whatever direction.
Whatever direction I thought was going to go, I went. Right, and I mean I have scars across my legs that I fell and by all these things when you're running, when you're in the moment of panic, your body sort of goes into a very different mode. So I have no idea how I survived, but somehow I managed to. I ended up in Butembo, and there I ended up meeting a man who actually was a store owner that ended up taking me back to my family.
Weren't you scared of talking to anyone at that point? Like, did you think that there's no one you can trust after that happened?
So when I arrived in Butembo, I recognized the place. I recognized the store because my dad used to take me there to buy me ice cream when I was a kid. So Butembo was, as I said, wasn't far. So in Beni and Butembo, they're like these twin cities. If you think of, I don't know how I could the closest example I guess I could have would be Toronto and Oakville, I guess. They're very similar style in the sense that
but they're 800 kilometers
They're 800
apart.
kilometers apart. They were just 800 kilometers apart. But the closest, I guess that's in terms of like the purpose of the city. So it was like almost like everything fed into the different cities. Butembo was sort of like where all the stores were the big sort of like chain stores where people stored their goods. And then Beni was sort of like the middle city in the sense that where people lived, and then there was a middle market where people sold their goods as well. But Butembo was sort of like the bigger.
Got it.
Anyways, and so I was scared, but because I recognized the store, I ended up running towards it, and so the store owner recognized me, and that's how I ended up in Beni. But what was happening around that time, so the reason why the military was being so, even though they were getting paid, was that Mobutu, who was the guy in power, had always been supported by the United States. For some geopolitical reasons. Of course, he was not as necessary anymore as he was before in the 80s. And so they were looking to replace him. Of course, as we always hear in the news, this guy's a dictator, but there's so many dictators, we never go and chase them away. We only go chase the ones we don't want to have in power anymore. So Mobutu had fallen out of favor with the international community, and he was being replaced by a guy named Kabila. And so around the 90s, this was the sort of the fight that was happening in that area of the world. We just had the Rwandese genocide that happened in 1994. So there were like these groups that had been fighting in this fight that were now in the Congo. So there was a lot of like geopolitical reasons, the reason why it was happening at that time. But again, as I said, now is when I've come to understand the context of what was happening to me and what was happening in my town. But at that time, honestly, I just saw military. And as a kid, I'm like, there's tanks and soldiers with guns that I'd never seen before in your town. It becomes a little scary.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you escaped. At that point, how did you get home?
Yeah. So I tell this in detail when I speak. But when I'm in the middle of the forest, this is how it even happened. So I'm in the middle, I'm running, and one morning I'm just like walking along like an open path, but I never stayed in the open. I would always walk aside where there are trees, so there's a little bit of cover for me, but I know there's an open, so I can see kind of what's happening behind me and in front of me. And so I'm walking across this little forest, and I hear sounds. And I started to hear trucks that were passing by. And at first I thought that maybe the soldiers had chased me and they'd finally caught up to me. So I laid in the grass and I waited and I just stayed. And of course at this time I'm panicking. My heart's beating really fast. And I'm trying to figure out like, where do I run? Where do I go? If they get me again, they're going to kill me. So I hear the sounds. They're still there. The trucks that keep moving. They're like in and out. And I laid in the grass for a few minutes, and then I started to crawl through the grass to go and see where the sound was coming from, because then I started to hear the sound of women speaking. And so I walk around, and I open the grass, and there's this huge dirt path, and you can see trucks clearly driving by, and there are these women with stuff on top of their head, and they're walking, and they're going in a certain direction. There are other people with like little bikes biking around. So I start to walk in the forest, following where everyone's sort of going. And as I'm sort of arriving, I ended up arriving in a path where there's no forest, of course, and it's just like a bigger road going into the town of Butembo. And I recognized the town, so I recognized the store on the left side of the road, and I ran towards it. And I kept racing down, yelling for my father's name. And of course, everybody's sort of looking at me strangely, this kid coming out of the forest. And I ended up running into the store, and the store owner recognized me. But to be quite honest, that's the last thing that I remember, because the only thing I remember from that day was I arrived in the store, and I'm yelling at this guy to take me to my dad. The other memories I have of that day was I was in the... there's a bus that goes from Butembo to Beni called Stout. And I remember I was in the back of the I remember when we climbed into the bus. I remember sitting in the back with the man. He'd been holding me, and there was a few like soldiers, not soldiers, but like police officers that had been there. And so we ended up going into the truck, and there were people, and they ended up in a hospital, and my mom was next to me is the next thing I remember, with my two older sisters next to me as well, and they're crying, and that's how I escaped. And I found my way home.
That's amazing, because as a 5-year-old, you just had like a primitive instinct to survive.
Yeah.
You didn't know what you were doing or how or what, but you just did it somehow. So that's interesting. Obviously, there's so much more to your story, but we're not going to cover everything that happened in your life. But the biggest thing is to take away here is that you've been through more than what most people have been through, more trauma than what most people have been through. How have you dealt with that? How do you if you are still feeling it, how do you continue to deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I always talk about is this idea of healing. And this is a word that's, especially here in North America, we use that word healing quite freely. And for most people who've been through war, and I'm sure, if you talk to your parents, I'm sure they'll probably say the same thing. The idea of healing is this, like, especially people who've been affected by war, it's this concept that you're always trying to attain. But it sometimes feels like it's this unattainable thing, primarily, especially for people who've been traumatized by the conflicts, and to the extent that I have, I don't think there is healing. And this is the most difficult thing you have to come to accept, that I've come to accept, is that in my day-to-day life, life has been changed forever. My childhood was completely changed after that experience. And then going through the war that came afterwards, after I had gotten back home, completely changed who I am. You wake up sometimes and when you hear like loud bangs, and of course I have post-traumatic stress, and that has become a huge part of who I am, of course. But I think what has enabled me to be able to speak about it to the extent that I do now, and to have some semblance of healing, honestly, one has been talking about it, accepting the reality that this is something that happened to me, and not being able to let it affect who I am. But in doing so, it's actually given me a lot of purpose in what I do. So whether it's the graphic novel that I authored a few years ago, or the speeches I give, and sort of the keynotes that I give at different venues, whether it's giving lectures for law schools on the issues of children's rights, or continuing my father's work on human rights specifically. All of these things have given my story purpose. So it's not just, I'm not telling my story for people to feel sorry for me. Honestly, I don't need someone's pity, nor do I feel somebody to feel sorry for me. But what I do want is for that to change, because in the world today there are 250,000 child soldiers that fight in the many conflicts that we hear about in the world. And most people, when they hear the term child soldiers, they tend to think, oh, it's an Africa thing. But not so long ago, literally almost a year ago, you were on the news and ISIS was recruiting children, and they're displaying them, literally being used. You look in Colombia, and the FRDC, they're recruiting children from a long time ago. The United States, because child soldiers are considered, anyone who's 16 and under is considered a child. The United States recruits 16-year-olds. And in the world, in terms of actually, if you go by law, international law, they're recruiting children.
Right.
And so this is a thing that still happens around the world, sadly. And to some, it of course all varies to some extent. Not everyone goes through similar experiences. Some of them go through worse. And so the idea of me telling my story has actually helped in being able to achieve some kind of purpose with my story. So it's not just someone telling just another story. And
throughout your journey, have you noticed, or not noticed, but have you connected with anyone else or many other people that have had similar experiences? Maybe not necessarily child soldiers, but maybe they were trafficked as children for sex purposes or whatnot. Have there been people that have told you that you changed their lives or impacted them?
Yeah, I mean, and this is what I was saying, the purpose aspect to my story. It's not just that too as well. I've met many people. There are many former child soldiers that are a part of in the world today. I can name a few who are public about it. We have Emmanuel Jal, who's a musician. He lives here in Toronto, and he's an incredible artist, and he's been speaking about his story, and he wrote a book called War Child. You have a woman, I forgot her name, but she's from Uganda, with the LRA, and anyone who remembers sort of the phenomenon of Kony 2012 will remember about the LRA. So this girl from northern Uganda was actually recruited when she was, and this is one thing that people don't know about child soldiers, is that most of the members of child soldiers actually are women. They're girls. not even women, girls who are recruited not just to do
Why so?
fighting, because girls do much more than just fighting. They can cook, they can give birth to children, so for sexual purposes, and variety of other just unspeakable things. And so, I've met many who have been impacted not just by my story, but their own stories. But it goes beyond just people who've been affected by war. Even here in Canada, I've given many speeches at schools. I've met many people who have been impacted by my story. Not so long ago, I was at the Toronto International Film Festival. There was a documentary going on, and I was sitting by myself. I was going to watch this documentary, and I'm sitting by myself on the seat, and this girl walks by, then walks by again. And at first I'm like, this is becoming a little creepy. And she comes and then sits next to me. I'm just like, okay, here we go. And she turns to me and says, "Are you Michel Chikwanine?" And I said, "Yeah." And she says, "You came to my school in 2010 and you gave a talk and you spoke about your childhood, but you also spoke about your experience being bullied when you arrived in Canada and what that was like." And she says, "What you don't know is that at that time in high school, I was getting bullied. And your experience of how you were able to go from where you were, use that experience to deal with what you were being bullied here in high school in Canada, and how you were able to become the person that you are today has fundamentally changed who I am. That day when you spoke, after that day, I ended up embracing who I was and the fact that I wanted to dance, and that was ended up taking me to Ghana and she's from the Caribbean, but she ended up going to Ghana, and this profoundly changed her life. And this is not the first one, right? There are many people that I've met throughout my journey, and that's the most important thing I think that I've learned throughout me speaking about my story, is realizing a quote that I went to Catholic high school in Ottawa, and the chaplain at that school once told me that you'll never hate a person whose story you know. And that has been a huge testament in the sense that people who because as human beings we're social beings. Well, when you hear somebody's story and you empathize, at least if you have the ability to empathize, of course, that you'll never hate that person if you actually truly understand, because you see yourself in their story.
Right.
And that's one of the purposes that I've wanted to really pass along, is that we all have the ability to empathize with each other if we actually take the time to listen, that we are actually not different than we really think we are, people tell us to be.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we're all kind of connected in one way or another. And maybe like certain people, like I'm sure at some point you felt like you were alone, like you were the only person that went through something like that.
Yes.
Whereas,
Yeah.
I never knew about you getting bullied when you came here.
Oh, absolutely.
What happened? Well, how old were you anyways?
I was 16 when I arrived in Canada. 16, so I came in Canada when I was in 2004. I became so I arrived in Ottawa at this high school, and the high school was I was one of very few black people in the school. And the school itself, whenever they saw me, I was this very eccentric African kid who gave people high fives all the time. And we went to Catholic high school where we wore uniform. And of course, in high school, every time I had an accent, of course, everything. And so people used to tell me, they're like, you're so weird. You're so weird. You talk about soccer when you don't talk about basketball. You never talk about hip hop. You only talk about Congolese music. Who cares? And so they started to nickname me things like Blackie or Africa. And whenever they would call me Blackie, I always thought like, yeah, of course I'm black, whatever. And they say Africa, I'm like, yeah, I'm extremely proud to be African. I never took it as an insult. And it wasn't until a friend of mine pulled me aside one day and he told me, he's like, they don't mean those things in a positive way. They're actually trying to like demean you.
Right.
And that was actually one of the moments that actually sparked my interest in telling my story, because I remember feeling like, why would anybody, one, hate me for being black? Like, there's nothing I can do about my skin. I was born this way. Yeah. And then two, why would anybody hate anything about Africa? Because despite what I had experienced, the memories I had of home, to me, superseded any negative experience that I'd gone through life. It was my experience of my family and the friends and the people that I saw that that I remember of Africa. So what the perception that they had of Africa was completely wrong. And so I was curious to know where they got this perception from.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of me allowing to be bullied in high school, and as most people's experiences become, you tend to sort of go within yourself, you hide, especially in high school, because you're trying to find your own identity, and it's a very precarious time for many teenagers.
Yeah.
To me, I just became curious. I started asking them, like, why do you think Africa is bad? And, why do you think being black is bad? And, so and it forced people to actually, I'd have to confront them.
Mm-hmm.
And so in high school, this is partly why the chaplain pulled me aside, and he said, you'd never hate a person whose story you know, because
Mm-hmm.
I started to tell them my story. I started to explain to them the fact that my father had been assassinated for trying to reveal the fact that coltan, which is used in our electronics, is the reason why the war in Congo is going on, and not because Congolese people like killing themselves, as most people like to believe.
Most people probably have no idea about any of that anyways.
No idea.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so my dad's role as a human rights activist was try to expose this reality to the world. And of course, because as I said, there's a lot of money, of course, interest involved in the Congo for its natural resources. He was targeted, and sadly he was killed for it, for his activism. And so I confronted people with this truth. And especially, and I remember one time actually I was in English class, and it was my first time coming out of ESL. It was grade 10 English class, and I remember the teacher, his name is Mr. Gadua. Didn't know anything. I didn't know anyone in class. I sat in the second row of class. He was on the left side, and he pointed to my seat, and he said, "Everyone that sits in that seat has an amazing story to tell." And so I'm like looking around. I'm like, "Are you talking to me?" And he goes, "I want everyone in here to write an epiphany essay." And that was the first assignment we had in class. Like, literally, he's just introducing himself. He's like, "I want to get to know you guys." So an epiphany essay, he's like, when you guys have this aha moment, he's like, write something, this aha moment that you've had in your life. It could be a bird that you had and that died. It could be your grandma told you something amazing. Just write something very profound that happened to you. And 2 rows behind me is this girl, and she's complaining. She's like, "I think I want to write about why it's important for parents to listen to their kids." And it was because she had asked her parents to buy her a pink Motorola Razr. I don't know if you remember those flip.
I do.
She wanted a pink Motorola Razr flip phone. They got her a black Motorola Razr, so she was complaining. She was like, "I wanted a pink Motorola, not a black Motorola." And I remember as I heard her like telling her friends about this essay she was going to write. And I remember thinking, like, and she was one of the people that used to call me Blackie. I remember she has no idea that it was my dad's work for her to get the cell phone. Is my dad's work to try and tell the world that if only these companies were to pay Congolese people fairly, that we wouldn't have a war. I wouldn't have to be here if they didn't want me to be here. And so I wrote my first essay about my father's work, of him being a human rights activist, and that kind of what sparked my interest into speaking. So I went from being bullied, curiosity, and then trying to do something about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot. There's a lot in there. One thing you made me think of with your story was I went to a French high school in Mississauga,
Right.
and there were a lot of African
Right.
kids there because of the French.
Yeah.
And one time I was walking through the hall and I saw these 2 young black boys that were holding hands walking.
Yes.
And one of my best friends was black, and I asked him, like, have you seen these guys before? Do you know what's going on?
Yeah.
And because it's just odd to see two boys holding hands. And then he's like, in Africa that's normal.
Yeah.
Boys hold hands. I don't remember why he said that, but he said like they probably just came here and they're still doing that, but somebody's going to tell them soon not to do that.
Of course. Yeah. Which is very sad, don't you think? It's very strange. It's like I remember that as a kid. Even now, I go back and I travel to the continent. I went back a few years ago to go see my cousins. And literally, I arrive and the first thing my cousins does is like hold my hand.
Yeah.
And after living in Canada for so long, you become very conscious of these things. But then I was like, I used to do this as a kid. Literally,
Yeah.
you see people. Even now, you can go on the continent, see grown men going around swinging hands
Oh,
as
really?
they're holding. Like, it's such a normal thing to see,
Yeah.
you know. But from this side of the world, of course, you know, there's all these like realities when it comes to what the connotations of what that means.
What is normal and what is not, right? It's
Exactly.
just like it's not considered normal here to
yeah.
see that normal
Yeah.
behavior.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I guess we all get conditioned differently based
Absolutely.
on our surroundings.
Yeah. There in Congo and many parts of Africa, that just a sign of friendship. It's
Mhm.
like this is my person. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure it's like that in different parts of the world too. Yeah. And another thing that you were saying, like the term blackie, how you were called that.
Mhm.
I remember even in my school,
Mm.
certain like if somebody was dark, they would
Right.
call him names like that,
Yeah.
or they would call him darkness. There was one guy I remember they would call him
Mm.
darkness,
Mm.
and it was other black people that were calling him that too,
Right.
which was weird.
Yes.
Like the lighter skinned
Yes.
black people were saying that to
Yeah,
him,
Yeah.
and like me, people would say terms to me that they
Mm.
thought were funny.
Right.
Like for example, because I have an Arabic background, they would say I'm a terrorist.
Mm.
Or they
Of
would say
course.
that to like some of my friends that were maybe Arabic. And it's just when you think about it at first, it sounds like a joke and you
Mm.
go along with it, and you even maybe will start saying that to your friends.
Right.
Playing along with it. And then you realize that is a very demeaning term.
Mhm.
That's not, even though it may not mean much to you and
Yeah.
you're just saying it, but it's not something that should be said.
It comes
Yeah.
with a lot of social connotations, right?
Mhm.
Like it's in. I mean, we could unpack all of those things in
Yeah,
many different
yeah.
ways, and within the continent, within the context of your black friends calling their light skinned black friends calling
Yeah.
their dark skinned black friend, you know, darkness. It is colorism is a huge thing on the continent of, and not just even on the continent. You can see it in India. Colorism is
Mhm.
it's a huge problem in the world, and that is it is, if you truly follow along of where that comes from, where that idea comes from itself. There's a huge history around the idea of colorism in the world, and in the continent of Africa specifically, as this is where I really know best, is the context was around, so in the 1950s, 60s around, so when colonialism sort of was a huge thing on the continent of Africa, the idea of being dark was seen as something that was not, you shouldn't be dark.
Mhm.
Being dark was considered to be a symbol of savagery. Like, as a savage, you know, you're closer to an animal than you are closer to the white. The closer you are to being
Mhm.
white, is the more civilized you seem to
Right.
be, right? And so they started creating these soaps where you could, like, lightning soaps. Right. If you go to Jamaica too, this still happens. This, and people even on the continent of Africa
Was it
still
like chemicals or
yeah,
something?
chemicals, but they give you cancer.
Yeah.
And so there's even in the South, even in the United States, you can even see like ads that they were selling of with a dark skinned person being like washed by this white person to wash off their darkness.
Wow.
Right. And so it has this huge social connotation that comes from this idea of like
Mhm.
being white and racism. This is really where that comes
Yeah,
from.
yeah.
But yet people like have really adopted it, and
Yeah.
this shows you just how much racism has gone across history and how much it continues to impact
Mhm.
people, even though for most people they wouldn't even think of that.
For sure.
But
yeah.
it affects so many different people, because of course, imagine being called darkness, and if I had been called that, I was just blackie and didn't have the strong background that I had from my family. Imagine how that would affect me,
Mhm.
like just socially as a child, as a teenager, being called and being named and being humiliated in a
Yeah.
sense, right?
Yeah, I think everybody, for the most part, gets humiliated in some way.
Yes.
And like even me personally,
Right.
when I was a kid, I was bullied too for my skin color
Right.
because I went to a French school. Like I said, this was different from the high school, but there were a lot of white kids there,
Yeah.
white French Canadians,
Yeah.
basically. And I was one of the only people that looked this way, that had the
Mm.
darker skin
Right.
and the thick eyebrows.
Of course.
So I was different, and I was called a lot of names, and I was like physically bullied. It helped develop my character
Of course.
a lot.
Yeah.
But I even remember wanting to be lighter at
Mhm.
some point
Mm-hmm.
when I was a child.
Yeah.
I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be like all the white kids.
Right.
And nobody can say anything to me if I'm white, right? That's
Of
what I
course.
was thinking. So
Right.
I can definitely see how those terms shouldn't be said, but what can you do really? How can you...
Yeah. I think it's just it's being able to, and this was one of the most important things I think that I learned going to high school. when you have different people who come in with different experiences. So when I go to different high schools, this is why teachers have had me at different schools to speak, is I'm able to sort of like relate to a lot of the students because I went through high school. I know what that experience was like. And I'm able to tell my story, and not just this story that seems so foreign to many people on this side of the world, but I'm also able to like connect how that story itself is so universal in the sense that even when I came here, my story for people who didn't know me, as I'm walking around the street, people wouldn't see, oh, that guy was a former child soldier. They're just, it's just another black guy. You know what I mean? But there is a story, and this is what and the point that I was saying, like, you'd never hate a person whose story you know. And that's the important part, I think, that I really loved about coming to Canada when we were told, was when you become a refugee, you literally have no rights. When you're a refugee, you're like no one. Until you get a refugee number, which is very hard to get. So when we got a refugee number and my father was assassinated in Uganda, we were put in an expedited process, primarily because our family was in danger. And so we came to Canada because my dad had told people that if we ever get an opportunity to get asylum, that he wanted to go to Canada because to him Canada represented like freedom. Whenever everything we heard of Canada was like freedom. And so that's the reputation that Canada has. And I think in general as a society in Canada we have to uphold that. So that means calling out people for saying, of course it does build character, but we shouldn't allow people bullying others to be able to say that that's okay. You know what I mean? It shouldn't be okay. Like, of course, there's teasing. I have no problem with teasing. Boys always, I mean, as a kid, we used to tease each other. It's part of course, socializing. But when it starts to go into demeaning people's character, people's backgrounds, then we're crossing a line that I think is extremely wrong.
It's almost criminal in some ways because a lot of children, when they go through those experiences, they want to take their lives.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And there's multiple experiences of that, and we have stories behind that and what that does to people psychologically. And some people, of course, and this is the most important part, is some people experience it differently than others. That people who are very strong-willed, and whenever you tease them, they're like, I don't care. Yeah. Very similar to me. I know other people that if that was their experience, like, that will scar them for life, and that will change their whole perception of who they are as a human being. Right. Yeah.
So just out of curiosity, did you ever experience any bullying in Africa? I know you were really young. You were, I don't know, you left at what, 11?
I left when I was 11. I left Congo when I was 11, and I left Uganda where I was a refugee when I was 16.
Okay, so did you experience any bullying there?
Yeah, of course, The bullying there, when I first came back, so when I first escaped and came back home, my dad was very protective of me, so I never left the house. I was always with him, and this is why my father became sort of such a profound figure in my life. Right. He was always with me. He was trying to be protective of me, and when I first went back to school, of course I didn't know, but of course the story had gone around town that this kid and he had come back, he had been lost, and so some kids used to tease me, and they used to tease for the child soldier experience, and calling me a child killer. Wow. They would call my sister a sister of a child killer. Wow. And of course this impacted me quite a lot, and I started to get into a lot of fights in school. I remember once I grabbed the kid who was yelling at my little sister, and I ran over to this kid, and I grabbed his head, and I like shoved his head in the grass, and I was feeding him grass. I was like, dare you call me that one more time. And I became a very violent kid. And so my dad took me out of school, and they took me to a town called Goma, which wasn't far away from Beni itself too. And I ended up living with my aunt and my cousins. And so it was a very... It does happen on the continent, right? Bullying, I think, is a very universal thing that happens everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you're white, and I guess that's what's most important. It's like it's exclusive to North America. Bullying is really everywhere, and it should be called out exactly for just that. And so, I did experience bullying quite a bit. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just a couple more things before we wrap up. One, I want to know what you take from all of your experiences. What is the lesson that you've learned from everything, and how has it impacted your life positively? I know it's a terrible story, but there's always something positive out of every experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are many positive things, and because of time constraint, we could go on. I always say that honestly, I could spend 5 hours speaking. There are so many stories, but my dad was the most amazing human being I have ever met. Of course, on top of him being this giant man, I always thought my dad would never die, would never get killed. He was this amazing man. And of course, I'm sure he had his flaws, but over time people start to forget people's flaws and you only remember the good things about them. But my dad genuinely was a good human being. And one of the things he told me right before he died, he reiterated a point that still stays with me today. And he always said, always remember that great men and great women throughout history have never been praised for their money nor their success, but rather for their heart and what they do for others.
Mm-hmm.
And he always pointed out to people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and he said, you can have all the money you want, but over time people will not remember you for your money. They'll remember you for the impact you had on others in society. Yeah. And so he always told me to always pursue leaving a positive legacy for others, because at the end of the day, that's what defines you as a human being. And so that has, as I've grown and sort of let go of this terrible experience that happened to me, I have tried to figure out, how do you take a story or an experience that has profoundly changed your humanity and use it to leave a positive legacy for others. Mm-hmm. Storytelling was a huge part of my culture, and so it just seemed so like a good thing to do, to storytell. I became a storyteller. That's how I ended up becoming a public speaker, because storytelling was something that I was good at, I could do. And I figured out ways that, okay, what are the positive aspects of the things that I went through? Yes, it taught me about resilience. The importance of being a resilient human being and having courage. And courage is this buzzword that people use all the time, and sometimes it can sound very corny. But Nelson Mandela once said that that a brave man is not a man who's not a brave man is not a man who's not afraid, but who conquers their fear. And whenever I think about fear, I think about every single person who's always afraid to take a chance, because fear debilitates our ability to actually achieve something great in us. Well, we're afraid how people are going to perceive us. We're afraid to stand up. If you're at work, for example, and you have a point that you want to make, you feel sometimes afraid, like, what will people think of me? What will my boss say of me? And so you're afraid, and so you close yourself in. You're like, you know what, I'll be safe. I'll just take the safe route. Even when you're trying to achieve something on your own, whether it's a business idea that you want to have, you feel afraid. You're like, I don't know how people are going to take it, so I'll just play the safe game, because it's easy. But if it was easy, if everything in life was about being safe and just easy, then we wouldn't have Apple as a company. I wouldn't be here as a human being, because my mom was courageous enough to walk every single day in the middle of one of the most dangerous streets for women to try and get us a refugee number. And she did. For 5 years, she would do this every morning, waking up at 5 a.m., walk for 3 hours every day. Wow. Without knowing that they would see her, just hoping that someone would hear her story. And eventually somebody did.
5 years.
5 years.
3 hours.
3 hours every day, Monday to Friday, except for weekends when she would stay home to try and make something so she could sell. And so every day I was reminded of, like, this is the courage to be able to achieve something. One, it takes, of course, that courage for you to actually come out of fighting your fear of your potential of what you could achieve, but actually pursuing that thing relentlessly, that it doesn't just come easy, that this will take hours and hours and hours of doing things. And so I remember being like, everything that I have achieved now comes from those lessons that I learned, not just from my family, but from just the world around me, and being able to overcome my fear. The second thing that important lesson I've learned from my experience as well was the importance of pursuing knowledge, of always being a person who always wants to learn. And I learned this primarily from my dad, who, when I was a kid, my little sister Marizia used to use her left hand to eat. And in my culture, and I'm sure even in Middle Eastern cultures, using your left hand to eat is like, it's a very offensive thing, primarily because people eat on one plate and you're sharing with everyone else. And your left hand is usually used to clean yourself after number two. And, so I won't explain to people how that works, but just imagine, of course, people usually wash their hands and there's soap, but generally just the idea of like this, your hand was somewhere and then using your left hand to eat is just like, so my little sister Marizia would get beaten all the time for using her left hand. And my dad didn't understand why she was the only person in my family that used her left hand. And so he called one of his friends. He mailed one of his friends to send him a book about people that use their left hand. And in the book, he read it, and it ended up talking about if you force someone at a very young age to try and use their right hand, it might slow down their growth. And from that moment onwards, my father defied his own culture understanding for truth. And I remember that lesson to this day, because it's like it showed me for the very first time in my life that what we think is true sometimes can actually block what is actually right. And so it always made me question whatever I think is true. So I always spend most of my time, what I think is my truth, I always question it. I'm like, do I really think this way? Like, why do I think this way? And so no matter what project I go into, I always start off with asking myself why. And there's an amazing TED Talk by Simon Sinek. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
Yeah, I've heard of him
and
with the glasses, right?
Yeah. So Simon Sinek goes and he has a story, and he talks about how Apple became. He talks about how Apple came to monopolize and become such an important company. He's like, Apple, Samsung, and all these Android phones, they all make the same product. When you really think about it, it's the same product they're making. But why is it that Apple, under what's his name? Not Tim Cook, but the founder of Apple,
Steve Jobs.
Yep. Sorry. So under Steve Jobs, why did Apple under Steve Jobs become such a huge and important company and actually surpass all the other companies? And it's like, because a lot of the products of where Steve Jobs used to sort of like get his inspirations from, he always asked himself why. The first question before he created a product, we always asked, why? Why is this going to be important to society? Like, why should someone buy this product? But most companies, every company or every person that starts out with a product, they always starts off with thinking about how this is going to be viable for the market, right? You start off with the why, who you're going to sell it to, and then the why is the last piece that people think about. But the reason why you think about the why is because it is important for you to put yourself in the shoes of somebody that's going to buy your product, or somebody that's going to actually, if you're going to sell an idea, whatever it is. That why should they listen to you? Why are you so important? Why are you so different from everybody else? Right? And you start off from that way, then I think anything becomes successful, because at the end of the day, people want to feel like you're using an Apple. It puts you in a different category, because it's something like, wow, an Apple product. It's the same product, but yet somehow it seems like people want to buy them all the time, right? Because they tell you that it lasts longer, and perhaps it does, and perhaps the reason why it lasts longer is because maybe they thought about how do you make this product viable for the market that it's necessary, that are going to buy for it. So to bring it back to the lessons of how I got to learn things I learned from my story, is all these lessons taught me about how you become a personal person to other people, right? The personal growth that you have is asking yourself questions and always being able to learn. And that has allowed me to learn about not just about my story and the fact that there are 250,000 child soldiers, but it has allowed me to put context to that story. So it's not just another child soldier story, because I am more than just a child soldier, right? I am an author now. I'm an African. I have so much. I have history. I know so much about my life, about the world in general, primarily because I've allowed myself to see myself beyond what I think and what the world thinks of me in general.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. This has been awesome. I loved the content and everything that you were sharing. I just usually like to finish things off with the random 5.
Right.
I'm going to ask you 5 random questions.
Okay.
And you can just answer with whatever comes to mind first. What's your most fulfilling and largest goal?
What's my most fulfilling and largest? The most fulfilling goal so far that I've achieved has been publishing my graphic novel. The graphic novel, primarily because my dad had always dreamt of publishing a book. Sadly, he was assassinated and killed before he was able to realize that dream. So in 2015, when my book was published, I was beyond the moon. It was 2016, sorry. I was beyond the moon because, one, it was a goal that my dad and a dream that he wanted to achieve, and I felt proud that I had done that for him. the biggest goal that I think a goal that I have is I would like to go back to the continent of Africa and work with young people. I want to create a vocational center, and this is something that I'm working on at the moment. A vocational center where I can get young people on the continent to sit down and have sort of like an opportunity in the space to talk about ideas that they want to do to fix some of the issues that their communities are facing. Because that's one of the largest things that I find is that we have the space. For example, we can sit here on a podcast and talk about many different things.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, on the continent, that's one of the saddest realities for young people is the spaces are very limited. And so I would like to create those type of spaces for them. And on top of that, as well as another goal that I currently have is my uncle runs a safari company in Uganda, and I just bought some shares in his company.
Oh, cool.
And so I want to make that safari company successful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I've been working on, and I'm thinking about how to make this. It was already a very successful business, but he sort of reached a ceiling where, of course, he cannot compete with other safari companies that are, getting money from India or Saudi Arabia,
Mm-hmm.
which is investing a lot of money in sort of this space tourism on the continent.
So he's getting his money from Michel.
Well, it's that, but it's also
Yeah.
just, of course, it's about, he helped my family quite a lot.
Mm.
He helped my family quite a lot, and I want to give him back. And so now it's just trying to figure out how you make a business successful.
Yeah.
And I'm learning on the fly, and so it's something. This is a goal that I have of mine to make it into a successful
Mhm.
business.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were touching on like how we're privileged here and we're able to sit and do a podcast.
Yes.
Have you ever seen or read The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind?
I've heard of that book. I've never read it.
Yeah, that's a really, really good story. Maybe
Yeah.
something for you to look into about famine in Africa.
Yes.
Yeah, so-
Yeah. I know of the story. I
Mhm.
remember hearing about it a few years ago, but I've actually never truly looked into it deeply.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
something for you maybe to look into.
absolutely.
What quality do you value most in a person?
What quality do I value most in a person? I think like I said, goes back to the two things I pointed out: people's courage, so their ability to
Mhm.
be able to overcome challenges easily, but their ability to learn, the willingness for people to learn.
Mhm.
There are many factors that I think qualities I admire in people, but I think kindness, your ability to learn, and being humble.
Mhm.
I think those are the three qualities that I would say I think are most important, because I think too many of us sometimes, especially when in my kind of work, we face a lot of issues, and people tend to say, I want to change the world, and they say right away, like, this is how we change the world.
Yeah.
But I think it was Albert Einstein who said that, if I had 1 hour to change the world, I'd spend 55 minutes asking the right questions, and 5 minutes,
Mhm.
coming up with solutions.
Right.
And I think not many of us take the time to actually sit back, be humble, and actually just listen.
Mm-hmm.
Too many of us want to do rather than listen and then actually do the right thing.
Right.
And so being humble, I think, is an amazing quality and a great leader and just a good person.
Mm-hmm.
And kindness, because I think the world sadly is not as kind as it should be, and I think we need a lot more of that.
Mm-hmm.
As cheesy as that sounds, but
Yeah,
it's
well,
actually
fair
true.
enough.
Yeah.
It's a good answer there.
Mhm.
Okay, number 3. What would be the most effective way to help children that are going through similar experiences? And that doesn't necessarily mean like child soldiers. It
Mm.
could be, or it
Mm.
could be maybe children that are being bullied.
Yeah. When it comes to the issue of child soldiers specifically, I think one thing that I think is important to understand is that it's not a standalone issue, right?
Mhm.
Like it's an issue that's affected by many different types reasons why it's happening. So the issue of child soldiers, to end it, requires so many steps. But the first thing I think to always learning about a step is always learning. So learn about the issue the issue itself, what's involved in it, why it's happening. One of the biggest reasons why the issue of child soldiers continues to exist is the proliferation of small armed weapons. That means we're having weapons that are being sold around the world that are easier for kids to actually use, right? That has facilitated the use of children. One of the sad realities that the same countries that have either pioneered or continue to try and uphold human rights and children's rights across the world through the United Nations, countries like the United States, Germany, China, Russia, Canada, or the G7 countries or G20 countries as they call them, are the same countries that since the 1950s have sold trillions worth of weapons across the world. And it's these weapons that actually end up in the hands of kids around the world, or end up killing kids, like the kids that died in Yemen very recently. It was on the news, and it's still happening today. Canada sold $15 million worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and kids died. Right? But yet we as Canadians vote people in who sadly see this, and they sell these weapons, and we don't keep them to account. So we have an election coming up in October, a federal election, and I know for many people we vote because we think our leaders only think about the issues that affect us locally. But as someone who travels and who sees the world, who has been affected by decisions that are made on the international stage, I say think about what the person you vote for is going to do, not just here in Canada, but for the international stage as well. So if we vote somebody who only sees the dollars, who only sees the economic value of society, but not the humanity of society, then what we're going to create are leaders like Donald Trump, who was asked very recently in an interview about $350 million worth of weapons sold to Saudi Arabia, and the fact that those weapons ended up in the hands of terrorists and actually killed children. He said, I don't care. It's good for our economy. So to me, it's, as a Canadian, voting is an important aspect of our society. But on top of it all, it's not just about voting, it's how you get engaged, right? So your knowledge. And so those are some of the things that I think you can do in an immediate sense to help the issue of child soldiers specifically, is so vote for leaders who are going to work on the international stage to hold people to account on children's rights, right? That's one way. So educate yourself on that topic. When it comes to things like bullying, I think one of the most amazing projects that was created by actually two Canadian kids from the East Coast, they have National Pink Shirt Day in Canada. It's around March, I think, and it's they basically were in Nova Scotia, and there are these grade 12 kids who went to high school, and one day this grade 9 kid walks into school and he's wearing a pink shirt, and this kid is starting to get bullied. And so these two high school grade 12 kids or just like, I couldn't understand why these people were bullying this grade 9-year-old kid, going back to what we're talking about, how that's going to shape that kid's career, and he's being called names. And so they went back after school and they went on Facebook and they sent out a message to everyone that the next day everyone should come wearing a pink shirt. And so the next school day, literally the whole school came in wearing pink shirt to stand up against the bullying that was being done to this grade 9-year-old kid. And this has taken over literally North America. And so at every March, I think it's every March, people wear pink shirts symbolically to stand up against bullying. So I think, again, educating ourselves against on that issue, maybe perhaps if you're in your workspace, being able to fundraise for organizations that deal with mental health by wearing pink shirts, and this one is something that you guys could do. Another thing that you could do, I think, is just I think taking people to see societies and communities that are not just their own. So for people, I always encourage high school students, and even beyond that, for people to travel. Because I think sometimes our inability to empathize and to see others comes from the fact that we just don't have the ability to see other people, other than because we see them on Instagram and Facebook. We think, oh yeah, I see the world, I know the world. But I think when you come out of your comfort zone, when you come out of your comfort space to see the world, you'll expand not only your mind, but you also expand the way you see yourself within the world, and allow yourself to empathize more. So please travel, and if you have children, like, get them to travel to see the world, and not just going down to the resort in Mexico and then sitting by the beach, but go to other places that may not be comfortable for you, but maybe will actually learn something new that you certainly don't understand. And I think that builds character for a lot of kids, not just for them to being teased, but it's also seeing the world builds up their own character. Right. I think it's important.
Yeah, and if you're looking for a safari in Uganda,
yes,
Michel knows a place.
Yeah, I know a place. Yeah, it's called AJ Tours, and so AJ Tours and Travel. Yeah, absolutely. Right, cool. I know a place. Okay, and who was your favorite athlete as a child? Who is it now? That's a great question. My favorite athlete as a child was actually Michael Jordan.
Okay.
And primarily because I didn't know anything about basketball. But I tell that story because my cousin used to tell me about I have a lot of different athletes because I love sports in general, but Michael Jordan is one that stands out. Primarily when I lived in the refugee camp, my cousin used to go into other people's tents and he would steal their magazines, and in the magazines he'd tell us about this place called North America. We only knew about America, but only in movies. And so he said that in this place called North America, the reason why people wear shoes all the time is because they want to show off that they have shoes. And it's primarily because they clean the streets in North America all the time. And that in North America, there was a man named Michael Jordan who used to throw a ball in a basket. And he was given $30 million to throw a ball in a basket. And I remember when he told me that, I was like, so you're telling me, so I grabbed a little basket and I put it on the ground and I grabbed the ball and I threw it into the basket, and I was like, you're telling me somewhere in North America there's a man named Michael Jordan who stands there throwing a ball in a basket and he gets paid $30 million to throw it in there. He's like, yeah, it does exist. It's in North America. And so anyways, this man, Michael Jordan, captured my imagination when I was in this refugee camp, and I always wanted to meet him. Sadly, I've never met him, but then I came to North America and I realized that, not everyone throws a ball in the basket.
And that's not why they wear shoes.
No.
Okay. Who has served as a mentor for you?
Many people, and I think it's important to always seek out mentors that are not just within your field of work or just field of life. Mentors in many different aspects. So my first mentor was always my dad. My father has been my biggest mentor. He left the best example and legacy that I continue to try and emulate and try to live up to. The second person is my chaplain from high school. She's the one that pushed me to really get into speaking and always saw the potential in me. The third mentor that I admire to this very day is a Canadian hero, a world hero. His name is General Romeo Dallaire, and he was the Canadian general in charge of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda right before the genocide started. And he asked the United Nations to send him a few soldiers to stop the genocide before it started in Rwanda in '94. Of course, the UN refused because of the political nature of the United States and the Security Council and all of these people. And of course the genocide happened, but he came back to Canada and he was deeply affected by what he saw in Rwanda. But yet he has come from that experience and he's become this amazing human being, an amazing Canadian, served in Parliament as a senator, and he's done incredible things for the world. So, and he's a great mentor for me to this very day. I mean, I have so many other mentors that, people that I've never met but I read about and that leave important legacies for the world. But those three I think are, and my mom actually. My mom is an amazing woman, actually, and has served a great example for me.
Yeah, that's an incredible story for her to persist for 5 years.
5 years.
I think if anyone persisted at anything for 5 years, they would probably do pretty well.
Yeah,
right?
but I mean, and it speaks to and so, I'm in Canada, and I think one of the biggest issues that we're probably going to hear about in this election coming up is going to be on the issue of immigration and refugees specifically. And as somebody who has been a refugee, who is a Canadian now, I can tell you that no refugee ever leaves their home because they feel like, I'm going to go and live a refugee life because it's an easy life.
Yeah.
Like, it's a desperate life. For someone to leave their home, leave everything that you've ever known, to try and seek asylum, it's because people are desperate. And people are not desperate because their countries are somehow, as Donald Trump likes to call them, S-holes. But it's because we are complicit in it. As I just explained with my dad's story of coltan and our ability to use electronics because of this mineral that's found in Congo. Right? And because we live in a system where people always want to make profit for less cost, people are going to seek out minerals where it's less costly. And in Congo, because it's conflict-ridden at the moment, people will want to keep it that way because it's good for profit.
Right. Yeah. So. Isn't there also lithium-ion batteries? Isn't that a big thing that they're mining for as well?
Yeah, Congo has everything. For electric cars. We have copper as well, copper for electric wires. Like, it's copper is very expensive. Most people never think of it, but copper is huge in Congo. Right. We have tin and tantalum. Like, there's literally every mineral you can try to find. They've just found oil as well now, which I'm terrified about because here we go. Like, it's. Yeah, I mean, but I think the most important aspect of it is as I said, like it's being able to see, or to just see beyond beyond what you see as a terrible thing, and seeing and being able to invest in people. This is why I really want to go back to Congo and invest in young people, to for them to come up with solutions for issues that they're facing within their own community. So I just think it is important to empower them. It really is. And one of a good friend of mine is from South Sudan. Sorry, I have so many stories. A good friend of mine from South Sudan, he started an organization called the Rainmaker Enterprise, and it's basically a solar-powered irrigation system that he's trying, water pump and irrigation system for farmers in South Sudan, primarily because of the war and of course of climate change. A lot of the country in South Sudan is turning into a desert, and so he's trying to help farmers by creating this solar-powered irrigation and water pump system to help farmers all year round.
Like
so they have
the wind.
Exactly.
Similar,
Oh yeah, very similar story. That's right. And so he was brought here to Canada through a program by an organization called WUSC, like WSC, that they give refugees scholarships to come and study here on any international post-secondary institutions. And these amazing young people are creating incredible things for their communities because you give them the ability to be able to continue their studies, right? So.
Okay. Good. Well, I know we can chat for a long time. I have one more question for you.
Yes.
Have you ever been back to that soccer field?
No.
Okay.
I haven't, sadly, I haven't been back to Congo since I was 11. This is one of my biggest regrets and my biggest hope to go. But sadly, because of the conflict in the Congo, there are a lot of people who were in power when my father was kidnapped and tortured for his work that are still in power. And so there's a great fear for me to go back. Some of it might be just unsubstantiated fear, because I do have family that still lives in Congo. I have like aunts and uncles and cousins. I have a big family that still lives in Congo, and they're fine. But it's just a fear that I still have.
Right.
My house sadly was destroyed, so my home is no longer there. So a lot of the things that I brought home, I want to go because, of course, home is always home. But I haven't been back since I was 11, right? And I'm now 31, so that was 20 years ago.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, before we wrap things up, is there any last message that you want to share, or do you want to maybe talk about something you might be able to offer someone or an organization of some sort? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Like I said, to me, I'm two things I think are very important for listeners and especially for us Canadians. I am huge into us being engaged politically, especially my generation, young people. People like to call us millennials, but I think we don't vote because we tend to think here in Canada especially that our vote doesn't matter, doesn't count. But I can tell you, like, it counts. It really matters, not just for Canadians, but for the world. And the type of leaders that we vote, we give them power. We empower them. So when we don't vote, just because it doesn't affect you personally does not mean that it doesn't affect someone else personally, not just here in Canada, but around the world. So be aware, be engaged as just Canadians, as listeners in general, as human beings. Be engaged in things that are not just here in Canada, but are across the world, and how all of us are implicated in it. Find organizations that are empowering not just people in Canada, but across the world. Like I said, this organization that brings refugees here, WSC, so WUSC, is an amazing organization that sadly, under Doug Ford, the funding has been cut, right? And we won't have anyone like Thuch, James, who started the Rainmaker Enterprise, right? Because he was given an opportunity and he's doing something for South Sudan. We'll never hear it on the news, but you'll hear South Sudan, oh, they're dying in South Sudan. But they're amazing young people that are actually doing something. And so find them, empower them, give them opportunities. And then, as I said, travel. Let's go see the world beyond just our confines of home here in Canada, because it's a big world and there are incredible people that live in it. And we have so much to do for the world.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And anything that you want to discuss in terms of services you offer, or anything of that sort?
I mean, my book. You have my my graphic novel, Child Soldier: When Boys and Girls Are Used in War. So it's a graphic novel that was targeted for kids aged 9 to 14. And then I do public speaking as well. So if you ever need someone to do a keynote for any conference, really, high schools, I do corporate conferences. You can email me at michel.chikwanine@gmail.com. I mean, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, literally everywhere on social media. I'm available. And again, if you ever want to go on safari, and if you ever gonna want to learn about the continent of Africa beyond just going on safari, of course, you can email me as well, and I can introduce you to my uncle. And he's a great chef. He used to be a chef for the European Union in Brussels. So he's a great chef, and is a great person of knowledge about the continent of Africa. And you can go see animals and see many other things about the beauty of the continent of Africa. Truly.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, once again, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
I appreciate hearing your story, and look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, George.
All right.